I
Okay,
see a
we're
lot.
live.
Yes, we're live. This is exciting, Terry. We're live on LinkedIn.
Yes, and YouTube and Facebook.
Right. We're equal opportunity live streamers. This is very exciting. And we started this about a year ago. We were talking just before we went live. But before we do any of that, Mike Palmer here and Terry, obviously, you're streaming this from your streaming
My
network,
kingdom.
your kingdom. So you want to introduce yourself just really quick at the top in case anyone doesn't know what's going on?
Yes, I am Terry Givens, and I am currently I'm a political scientist and a professor at McGill University, but I'm also the CEO and founder of Brighter Higher Ed. And we're also transitioning into becoming Brighter Professional Development because we're doing lots of workshops around my book, which came out in February. Some of you may have heard about it, Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides. And Mike and I have been talking higher ed for over a year now. It's been really fun.
Yeah. So we started last year in the throes of the. Actually, we started in the summer, like last. I'm trying to remember this right, get the chronology right, but we started right around when things were settled down after the first wave, and heading into the fall of 2020 was when the second wave really did kick in, and obviously campuses were very much a flashpoint for a lot of the conversations about the pandemic. That was something we started talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But as you were mentioning when we checked in earlier today, like we thought we would do this for a shorter run. Like we thought we would have a relatively narrow span of time where it was pandemic end times, very challenging and you're struggling through it and all, but you power through it. When you power through something, you think of it more as maybe a year at longest. And now we're heading into our second fall semester of things going long on this pandemic, and I think it's wearing us all down a little bit. But we're back to bring some keep hope alive, as Reverend Jackson has seems like he's beaten the COVID this go around too, which is also good to hear. But
yes, that was very good
yeah,
news.
yeah, exactly. So what's new in your world, Terry? Like it's back to school.
Yes.
You're in a new role this fall. Can you catch us up a little bit on what's happening on that side of things?
So, as I mentioned, I'm a professor of political science at McGill University, but I'm also the provost academic lead and advisor on their plan to combat anti-Black racism. And that's a broader strategy that they've developed. And of course, it's in response to events of the past year, but also kind of the history. So McGill does not have a good history on hiring Black faculty. And there's been a lot of discussion around this. And so they have a strategy to bring in more Black faculty. They've already gotten going on it. And so I'm just here to help out with that in any way I can, including getting the word out. So if you're a faculty member out there or a PhD student, come and join us at McGill. We're hiring in lots of areas: political science, sociology, English, on the medical faculty and the dentistry faculty and music. We just hired 3 amazing jazz musicians in the School of Music. So there's just a lot going on there. But it's also, just as a faculty member, it's been fascinating for me to watch this from the inside, what's going on with how McGill as a university is dealing with COVID. So, for example, there was a lot of discussion. So that it's interesting because I don't think a lot of people in the U.S. are hearing what's happening in Canada. And the province of Quebec has basically said, going to school is an essential activity. And so we can't require people to be vaccinated, but there's a very strong push to get people vaccinated. And so, but there's been a lot of discussion about this, whether the university can or can't require vaccinations. But frankly, there's a very high vaccination rate at McGill, or more broadly in Montreal and in Quebec, the province. And what I saw most recently, and it's probably gone up because of the new vaccine. Quebec does have a vaccine passport. I got mine. Luckily, it was easy because I already had a vaccine passport from California. That was relatively easy to get. And then all I had to do was upload the QR code to the Quebec app. And now I have my Quebec vaccine passport. But in
Right.
general, McGill has, everybody's wearing masks when indoors. And there's also some classes, like I'm teaching over 220 students this semester. So if you're over 150 students in the classroom, you're teaching remote. And I just did, actually right before this, I did my office hours remote. But I did have quite a few students show up and want to talk about what it's like to be a professor. But anyway, just, more generally, I'm finding that, it's interesting how we're still dealing with COVID. I don't think a year ago we thought we would still be dealing with COVID. Although I don't know even a year ago that we were really sure about the vaccines. They were still being tested. And now I think everybody's been, it was such a huge relief in the spring to have the vaccines, to see that they were effective. And now we've got these new variants. For those who are Loki fans, it's not a surprise that we have variants, but these variants are having an impact now. And I just canceled a trip to Washington State because there's actually, if I can, I'll post a link to this article in the chat, because there's a story about how Idaho is sending a lot of their sick COVID patients to Washington State because their hospitals are overloaded. And Washington State has been, Eastern Washington is not doing very well with COVID. And so that's having,
Right.
So I don't think people have thought as much about kind of how what's happening in one state is impacting other states and so on. So anyway, that's a lot, but that's what's going on in my world.
This show has become more cosmopolitan by virtue of you getting this gig at McGill. So now you're going to Montreal and even crossing borders. That border is more real now in terms of COVID policy and hopefully in terms of a relatively easy border crossing. Hopefully that's something that will continue.
Come back.
My God. Yeah,
So, I initially crossed the border back in July for my first trip to Montreal. And that was something, because even though I waited until you didn't have to do the 2-week quarantine, because it was, so I was on the first direct flight from San Francisco to Montreal after they said no more, 2-week quarantine if you're vaccinated. And Air Canada hadn't quite gotten all their act together around that. And so, it was, we had a long wait in line to check in, because everybody, you can't just, check in and get you can't do self check-in. You have to go and show your paperwork.
I was saying it's no longer George Clooney up in the air where you can just streamline your although what about the global access entry? Like,
well, that's fine that's fine when you're leaving, when you're like when you land, but when you're going to check in and check your bags and all of that, it's a longer process, because you have to you have to go to the agent and show them if you're vaccinated, and if you're not, of course, when you get to Canada, you have to get a COVID test. You have to have already done a COVID test.
And we already took our shoes off.
Exactly. So you have to have your COVID tests to travel internationally in most countries. You have to, for Canada at the time, I had to have a reason to go there. So I had to, at the time, I have a work permit now, but at the time I didn't have my work permit yet. So I had to show, the McGill had sent me all these documents I had to carry with me and show to and what's interesting to me as somebody who studies immigration is that, the desk agents are actually acting as, the immigration people, because they have to okay you to get on the plane. So they're looking through, and like this woman next to me was trying to go visit her pregnant daughter, and they were giving her all kinds of grief. And so it was just really interesting how this played out. And anyway, so our flight was delayed because they didn't have enough people checking people in. So we were delayed by an hour. And then what's the other thing I've noticed that's happening is people who are transferring flights. So maybe somebody flew from Asia to San Francisco and then San Francisco to Montreal. Well, some of those people aren't able to get into Canada because they didn't do all the things that they were supposed, or, too much time has lapsed between their COVID tests. So we had like 3 people on my first flight who couldn't fly to they had to be taken off the flight and rescheduled. And then the same thing happened the last time I flew. And so it's just crazy out there.
Yeah.
And then I had to go through the whole immigration process when I landed, and that took a while.
Right.
Anyway, this last time I flew to Montreal was much, much easier.
Yeah. I mean, and Montreal, there are worse places to be flying to as well.
Yes.
So Montreal is a wonderful town. We're going to have to learn more about that as we pick up with our this week or this month, whatever cadence we land on in terms of checking in about what's happening. But yeah, it's pretty interesting that also just because last fall and just fall in terms of these types of viruses, you do start getting concerned about what's the winter going to be like. And how resolved are we going to be out of all this? And then how's that going to impact the higher ed in terms of on campus versus online? You mentioned, above a certain number, you go to teaching it online. It is opening up a lot of the thinking, I think, around when you're face to face, what value are you getting out of it? And then what risk is there around the Brian Alexander? We like to cite his toggle term a lot on this show, but this idea that you go out with everything's going to be great, we're going to be in person, we're going to power through, and then if for whatever reason you have to go back on that decision, how beat up do you get in the press? How do parents feel about that? How do students feel about that? And how much value do students and parents and the rest of us feel like we're getting out of an online education if it's only delivered as a backup or a stopgap? It does feel like we're in a really. Any perspective on that now that you're more back in the ring as a teacher, as an academic, as a professor, and now you're doing it. So you're just doing it online now, then, or are you still doing
for now?
something?
Yeah, I'm only teaching one class per semester because I'm also doing the work on the anti-Black racism strategy and so on. But I was just talking to a student who was saying he took fewer classes last year because of COVID, and he didn't want to be all online. And but right now, one of the challenges for the students, and I think it's working so far as I can tell, it seems to be working out fine, is they may have one class live and then one class online. So where do you go to do the online class? And if you're in the library, or there's space. They've created, the nice thing is they've created spaces on campus for them to do those online classes. But it depends. You might end up only having a few, one class live and the rest online, depending if you're taking a lot of big classes, however it may work out. And then but I want to raise the other issue that's I've seen across higher ed is the situation where you have where students are being asked to wear masks, but maybe they aren't. There was this case of the professor who he had come back out of retirement to teach a particular class, and he ended up he told the students, look, I'm immune compromised, I need you to wear your mask. Well, one student came in late, didn't wear her mask, and he asked her to, and she wouldn't. And so anyway, he walked out, and he not only did he walk out of the classroom, he quit. And there's there's kind of this issue going on of who should the faculty are rising up and saying, hey, we especially I feel for faculty who have kids under 12 here, and actually that's just here in the US. I didn't realize in the UK they were only starting to talk about vaccinating kids under 18. But on the other hand, I just posted an article on Twitter about San Francisco schools. They haven't had any COVID outbreaks, and they've got a 90% vaccination rate for kids 12 through 17. So it's I think what's really fascinating is just the huge variation, right? I mean, some places are at 40%, others are at 70%. I think here we're not, in Montreal it's 70 to 80%. It's just really interesting to see how there are these differences from place to place.
Absolutely. And then for me, as a parent of a 2-year-old, there's no vaccines.
A very adorable 2-year-old, by the way.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. But the vaccine, there's not going to be a vaccine there, but also at the same time, universal 3K is here in New York City. So like, since Matthew, my son, turns 3 this year, even though it's the end of the year, he qualifies for the 3K, and that's starting, and you understand that's kind of got to be in person.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have like online 3K, but then at the same time, those kids can't really be vaccinated, although, hopefully they have the good immune systems, but it definitely brings it all home when you start thinking about those trade-offs. And it reminds me a little bit of the, going away to college is a similar, being exposed to other kids and giving your kids that room to kind of grow into the next chapter of their lives is very analogous, I think, to like when your kids are first leaving the nest. And especially for those of us who had that time during the pandemic where you're kind of on lockdown with your kids.
Mm-hmm.
It's true also, a lot of parents I've talked to who, you've had this recently where your kids are going away to college.
Mm-hmm.
During a precarious time, the emotional weight of managing not just your own life, but your kids' lives and their educational life and their social life as it relates to education. It's we ain't got time for this, Terri. We got stuff to get done.
Yeah, it's true. I mean,
Yeah.
We've had several webinars and discussions about kind of the mental health aspects of this whole thing, and we have one of our favorite people from Toronto, Steve Jordan's, who's been doing a lot of work around this. And if you haven't checked out Steve Jordan's course on, I think it's on Coursera, but he has this whole course on kind of how to deal with the mental health issues around all of this. And I know for me personally, it feels wearing, right? I mean, it feels like, and I've heard this from so many people, of course, and, there was the initial, oh, great, kind of relief that we're getting vaccinated, and then watching the variants, and then, sending my son back to school vaccinated, but, there have been outbreaks in his high school. And then for my college age son, there have, minor outbreaks where he is, and in a sense that people are getting tired of following the rules, and so that maybe they're being a little more risky in their behavior. I know I we went to an outdoor festival. We kind of stumbled on it when we were at the beach last weekend, but there's these outdoor festivals and things, and Montreal is a festival city. It's just that's what people do. They shut down entire streets, and people are, when I got to Montreal the last time, I my flight left by the time you get to Montreal, it's in the evening, and so I was like, oh, I got to go find some dinner. So I'm walking down the street, and there's all these people. I'm thinking, well, should I wear a mask or should I not wear a mask? Right. We're outdoors. I'm vaccinated, but it's kind of, I feel like there's this constant inner dialogue going on. Of course, when I'm indoors, I'm wearing a mask, and but I'm also starting to think about, okay, I'm going to have an 80 student class starting in January indoors. And it's Montreal, so it's going to be very, very cold, and you can't be outside at all. So I'm just like, okay, how do I feel about that? But I have colleagues right now who are teaching these classes. So I'm kind of watching what's happening with them, how they're managing. Are there any issues? And, what do you do when that student has to be out for a couple of weeks because they're in quarantine? And this has been a huge issue. Yeah.
Right. Which gets back to the modality question where, like, ultimately I can't see how this stuff isn't going to all be blended. Like, you're going to have some hybrid options available, and because there are times where you're going to want the high touch of being in the same room as other people, and depending on the nature of work, if it's problem-based learning or you're working on a group project together, you're going to want to be in the same space. But there are times when I heard about this a lot with the high flex model, that frequently students prefer to take a lecture on their laptop from their dorm room or from the library or from somewhere else that fits more into their lives. I can't see us putting that genie back in the bottle. Like, I would imagine that it's short term. It's still, I think, a question of costs and, change exhaustion, to your point, Terri. Like, it's hard to come up with like big sweeping reimagination projects when just maintaining through the weathering that we're all going through with the pandemic, particularly the emotional weathering, which is something, I've heard about that term more in the context of racism and, the types of uh, systemic stuff that keeps on hitting you all the time can really start to wear at you psychologically and emotionally. But I think in a lot of ways that is intersecting directly with the public health weathering that we're all going through right now, where our behaviors need to change to be conscious of it, and then hopefully we're managing that so that our health is actually okay. But just it's occupying a lot more of our working memory that could be applied to coming up with new things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's surprising, right? Because I think that's the thing. It's surprising how long it's lasting, and that opens up the scenario that this is now part of the new normal, is that there will always be some level of relatively serious risk that is counteracted by a regime of vaccination that continues to get updated. And you either sign on to, I'm going to get a shot every year, every maybe twice a year, even depending on how they figure it out. You just resign yourself to that, and sure, I'll wear a mask because, like, whatever. It's just stuff changes. Like, like for me as a New Yorker, I liken it very much to when Bloomberg banned smoking inside of bars. There was uproar and a lot of civil liberties, yada yada yada. It was still couched in the context of public health. And now there's so many people I know who were smokers who hated that idea when it was first put out there, who now credit him for their health, to credit that policy really for changing the culture so that the behavior changes. To me, it brings me back to like the behavioral economics idea, where like if you can nudge Richard Thaler's work, like can you design the decisions and the context for people so that they're steered towards hopefully a better path, which I just don't know how many carrots you can put behind getting vaccinated. By now, the perks are getting pretty good on the other. In some ways, I'm like, why didn't I hold out? It's going to get better.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there have been the lotteries and so on, but I'm looking at. So I was supposed to take a trip to Spokane, Washington, my hometown, and at the end of September, and I already mentioned that when I'm supposed to see. I already forgot I was going to post the article from the New York Times, but it's been really interesting to see what's happening. Even though I think Washington State has been doing a lot of the right things with masking and vaccination and all that, they're right next door to them is the state of Idaho, which is doing nothing basically, and they're trying to send all their sick people to Washington. Not all, sorry, shouldn't say it, and that's hyperbolic, but they do have, they're asking for hospital transfers and so on, and it's just been, so I'm basically canceling my trip because it's not just about whether I get COVID or not. It's about what if something, I have a medical emergency. Yeah. And that's what I think is really hitting a lot of people. So, what if, I know the numbers in Oregon are getting higher, and I'm putting the link here in the tab. And for those on LinkedIn, I'm going to post it there as well. But so if I'm looking down, it's because I'm watching LinkedIn Live on my phone. So because this isn't posting to there. And we got there's a question from Robert Gibson. Yeah. Yeah. So hi, Rob. It's really great to see you. So yeah, so there's things like what's happening kind of cross border in, places like Washington and Idaho. But Mike, we touched on that a little earlier about what Rob's asking about the number of faculty and staff seriously rethinking their careers. Yeah. And so, that is huge, and it's not just faculty and staff in higher ed. It's K through 12 teachers. For sure. I mentioned the story about the higher ed teacher who left, but there's actually a lot of K through 12 teachers, because keep in mind, it's even worse in K through 12 because teachers have, options. there's such a huge demand for teachers, K through 12 teachers, that if they decide to leave their job, it's not going to be that hard for them to go and find another job, but replacement is really hard. So this is going to be something that I think public, and obviously what's happening here, unfortunately, is political. I'm a political scientist, so we're seeing this becoming very, very, very unfortunate. This is becoming a partisan issue. So you have states where they're taking all kinds of measures, and then you have other states where they're doing less. So you're creating an incentive system for people, depending on their preference. They may decide, hey, I don't want to be in the state that's requiring masks and all this other stuff, and others may be saying, hey, I don't want to be in the state that's not requiring masks. So
right.
I think we have to look at it from the political perspective as well. And I really like Rob's point about this. It's just interesting stuff.
And Robert Gibson, for those of you who haven't seen him on LinkedIn, I get a lot of really great information from his feed. He's doing really great work out there, and this is another example of that. But I would think of it in another way as well, which is, in some ways, if you're not rethinking your career at this point, you probably should be. You don't necessarily need to be exiting your current role, but I think the way in which this stuff is going to be delivered is going to continue to evolve. And there are opportunities now around the reimagination that's happening within education for the next, say, 5 to 10 years. So I do think there is an opportunity to be flexible in terms of your career path. I think in some ways that flexible thinking hasn't really been built into the academy, where it's more, you almost are defending your position as you climb. Do you have any perspective on that, Terri? Like, how much, because you've sort of done both. You've left formal academia. You've also moved in an administrative role at different points in time. But what about this current state of play and, the opportunities to kind of branch out, do something different, move into another sector versus stay within? Because there is the critique both of higher ed and K-12 that it's really entrenched, hard to change. So if you're excited about doing some new and exciting things these days, any advice to folks out there in higher ed?
Well, there's so much going on. Oh my goodness. Where do you start? I mean, you've been following a lot of this in your podcast, Mike, the trends in education. Actually, my biggest piece for advice and for anybody, whether it's K through 12 or higher ed, is to start. Actually, there's so much of this discussion is going on LinkedIn. And we've been having these discussions in Clubhouse. There's a great series being done by Matt. What's Matt's last name?
Matt Alex.
Thank you, yep. Matt Alex. So if you aren't on Clubhouse yet, get on Clubhouse. I haven't been as active lately because I've been completely swamped and overwhelmed with my new job, but I will be getting back on there. And I have a Radical Empathy Club on Clubhouse, where we talk about topics from my book, Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides. And but also we talk about the latest in higher education. And we're, every campus is having this conversation right now, but faculty need to be aware of it because it could impact their future job situation. Are we going to be doing more online and remote teaching? I mean, one of the biggest topics out there right now is access. How do we get more students to have access? How do we get them micro-credentials or certificates? All of these things are in the mix. And faculty, this is why way back when I started the Center for Higher Education Leadership, because I realized, faculty, it's even hard to get faculty to be on LinkedIn. We need more faculty to become engaged in these conversations. And I know a lot are, but we need more. So my biggest piece of advice right now to any faculty member, K through 12 or higher ed, get on LinkedIn, join Clubhouse, get involved in these discussions, follow me, follow Mike, follow people like Matt Alex and Rob Gibson. And I see that's my nephew, Anthony, in there, who's up in Spokane. And see, it's you can see how incredibly sad I am that I did not make it to Spokane because I was going to get some great barbecue, but I'm coming as soon as things ease up, especially on the hospitalizations.
So Terri, I get another. I know we're trying to figure out how long we want to go, but one area I definitely wanted to get some of your perspective on is I know you're from Spokane. but you
Spokane.
spent Spokane. You're Spokane for, I understand. But you also spent a little bit of time in a state called Texas. And
Mm-hmm.
Texas has been very much in the news lately. I think maybe how higher ed intersects with some of the situation that's been emerging out of Texas. I'd love to get, and the Supreme Court, which is something more maybe from a political science perspective. You might have a little bit of a take on that. But any thoughts on where we are right now in terms of that issue and that issue as it might relate to higher ed? Because I would have, it's like access to safe abortions for university students is in some ways a flashpoint as well. Like whatever cultural challenges we have are going to be in some ways, played out on the stage that is higher ed. Oh, and we also got to talk about the chair, which I haven't really
That's
caught
right.
up on yet. But
Oh my
there's so much to
goodness.
talk about. So at least a beat or two on
Okay.
those. But
Okay.
starting with the
Yeah.
Texas. Yeah.
So we have to have a whole nother LinkedIn Live just about the chair. Okay. So
That sounds good. Yeah.
and
Table
I've
that.
watched the whole
Yeah.
series, so I'm caught up. But
No spoilers. No spoilers. Yeah.
We'll save that for another time because I have thoughts. But anyway, okay, so we're seeing these kind of political divides playing out in higher ed and across states and across borders and so on. And so I mean, God, we're in this really interesting political time where the whole issue of how students are having access to various things. So so for example, even on voter suppression, there's the big debate about whether students should be able to vote with their college ID. There's a whole abortion access issue. There's so all of these things are becoming part of, and they have been, these aren't new, these are issues that have been going on for a while, and obviously from state to state this varies. So yeah, I was in Texas for 12 years, and I was out there in front of the Capitol calling for women's health rights and so on. But of course, as a person, as an individual, not representing my institution, but and then you throw in the whole free speech issue, right? I mean, what are faculty and administrators allowed to do and say on social media? We keep having these situations where something will come up from somebody's Facebook, and it gets posted and spread, and cancel culture. So I mean, one of the things, again, I have to put in a plug for my friend Jonathan Friedman at Penn America. He's been working with campuses across the country and even across the border on these issues of how campuses should handle free speech. And the interesting thing is he and I have kind of gotten together on this because a lot of it comes back to radical empathy in the sense that sometimes it's not, yes, you have free speech and you have the right to do that, but should you do it? Right. It's not just a question of, okay, I have the right to do this. Like, should you do it? And there's personal responsibility, and there's a sense of care and compassion for people. And so I think those are some of the things we have to keep in mind, that it's not just about, am I going to score political points? It's like, am I taking care of the people around me and the people who I need to be supportive of? Am I taking care of my students in the classroom? I want them to have an environment where they feel included, and so on. And so, there's a lot of issues around this that we have to really manage. And so I think this is an ongoing discussion, and I'd love to get some of the folks, maybe Rob, we can get you on our next live cast to talk about this whole issue of the future of online learning. Because anyway, we could, when we have plenty of time. I'm not in a rush to go, so we can keep this going.
Well,
but
awesome. Yeah, well, because also we didn't touch on sports, which is another topic that we tend to touch on from time to time. Truth be told, I am a podcaster, a couple of podcasts out there, Trending in Education, been doing for 5 years now. That's my bread and butter. But also started a sports podcast called Running It Back with my friend Tarlin Ray, where we look for lessons learned from sports, but lots of lessons to be learned from this football season that just kicked off. And particularly if we're talking about higher ed, how college football relates to the national zeitgeist. I like to say the word zeitgeist as often as possible because it's fun to say. But any thoughts, Terri, in terms of what's been happening in college football, in the sports world in general, and how it might relate to higher ed?
Well, first of all, I have to cheer for my Cardinal, Stanford Cardinal. They got out there and kicked USC's butt. So yay, Stanford. But so Mike, you forgot the most obvious thing. We have players are able to get paid.
Oh my God, name and likeness, right? But that's kind of old news, though, right? Like maybe we haven't met in a while. That might be true. Yeah.
It's true. We haven't talked about it. Well, I mean,
That's
maybe
true.
we talked about it sort of, but I mean, but it's actually happening, right?
That's
not
true.
it's not hypothetical or just a kind of an abstract thing. It's actually
Right.
happening.
Right.
And so I think what's going to be interesting is, to get to see how this plays out. And, I've seen some articles about, basically the quarterbacks and the running backs and the star athletes are getting the attention and the
Right.
linebackers aren't. And there was one situation where one of the players shared his earnings with his team, and which makes sense because you want those linebackers to be blocking for you. I remember some of these quarterbacks will buy gifts for their linemen. It's like, you guys are saving my life.
That's right. Yeah.
But more broadly, to kind of pull it back into the COVID conversation, we're in a situation where the stadiums are full, and in some states people are vaccinated, some maybe not so much. We're it's outdoors, so are we okay? And but I have to bring in the whole Notre Dame situation from this last weekend, where they had their game was only on which streaming service was it on? Peacock.
Peacock, that makes sense.
So the game was only on Peacock, and I saw that there was a letter to the president complaining because you had to pay to watch, and in previous years most of these games were on NBC broadcast.
Yeah.
So
Notre Dame's football program is not necessarily what it used to be. Is part of what that tells us.
And that the stadium was fairly empty, and but I mean, you have to look at, they were playing Toledo. I mean, come on.
Right.
I think it'll be
quickly. Yeah. Also, while we're talking college sports, name, image, likeness. How about one J.R. Smith's name, image, and likeness in his professional? Sorry, not his professional. His NCAA college golf career. You're following that story? Because that is
not.
Oh, he's an amazing follow. If you aren't following J.R. Smith right now, because it's basically Rodney Dangerfield's back to school, except it's J.R. Smith, who is a former NBA basketball player. He's the guy who LeBron was going, I can't believe you just did that, JR, because he's a kind of famous for being a bit of a knucklehead as a basketball player.
Mm-hmm.
But now he's gone to University of North Carolina A&T, I think, to play, I think it's D1. I know it's college golf because he's taken up golf for years, but he's kind of funny in that he's tweeting about it and sort of sharing his kind of Rodney Dangerfield. Again, I equate this all to Back to School, the movie from the 80s with Rodney Dangerfield and the triple Lindy dive where he was part of the diving team. But again, I'm going too deep on this, Terri. Where do we land next? That was some of the A material. Yeah.
Well, I think where we land next is to kind of wrap things up here because we're going on 40 minutes, and
nice,
which is perfect. I think it's great podcast length, whatever you want to call it. But so I just want to conclude with, so I as always, I enjoy talking to you, and we get into so many different topics, and if folks out there have ideas like Rob, we're going to pull you in to talk about this whole issue of online learning and being flexible and stackable. And I know you've been following the news, and I'm sure, Mike, you've been following the news about the merger between Blackboard and I believe it's Anthology is the
that's right.
Yeah. So that's another big topic. So we have plenty of material to work with, and I'm busy at McGill, but these discussions are important and talking about the future of higher education. And we'll just keep this going, and we'll figure out our schedule eventually, because my life has been insane. Not only am I, teaching and doing this work at McGill, but I've also got another book I'm working on. So my publisher is on me to get that done. It's supposed to, so it's going to, on the roots of racism, that's coming out in January, as long as I keep to my schedule.
Yeah.
And again, I have to plug my other book, Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging
Yeah.
Racial Divides. Check
Mm-hmm.
in with
Mm-hmm.
me on LinkedIn or wherever you want. And we are doing workshops related to that. And I believe we will be able to get this discussion on our podcasts for This Week in Higher Ed. So this is our first, so we are celebrating, Mike. This is our first LinkedIn Live. This is
I
our
know.
first time using. So for those who don't know, well, actually, LinkedIn Live, you can use various platforms, but we are using StreamYard. So it's our first time on StreamYard, and we're learning all the ins and outs of that. And we thank those of you who have joined us for this discussion. And we'll be sure to get out with a schedule soon.
Yeah. All right.
All right, so I'm going to end us here. And Mike, big hugs to your little guy. And
Yes.
I'll make sure to give my big guys hugs. And I hope everybody is having a good back to school 2021.